July 1, 1944 arrived like any other day at Hollandia Air Base in New Guinea, thick with heat and humidity, the air heavy with fuel fumes and the low mechanical murmur of engines being serviced for yet another mission across the Pacific. 4 P-38 Lightnings rolled onto the runway after more than 6.5 hours in the air, their twin booms streaked with oil residue and salt spray, their pilots stiff and slow as they climbed down from cockpits that had held them captive since dawn. 3 of the aircraft came back the way everyone expected. Fuel gauges flirting with empty, warning lights glowing like quiet accusations, barely 50 gallons left in tanks that had been pushed to the edge of their endurance. But the 4th Lightning told a different story. Its pilot, a 42-year-old civilian, shut down his engines calmly, climbed out, and walked away while the ground crew chief stared at the fuel stick in disbelief. 210 gallons still sloshed in the tanks. Same mission. Same weather. Same aircraft. And yet somehow, this man had used 200 gallons less fuel than some of the best fighter pilots in the Pacific. The crew chief checked the measurement again. Then again. He had been around aircraft long enough to know when numbers were lying, but these numbers refused to change. 4 months, American pilots had flown the P-38 exactly as the manuals demanded. 2,200 RPM. Auto-rich mixture. Conservative power settings drilled into them since flight school, reinforced by technical orders that warned deviation meant engine failure, detonation, and death. Running high manifold pressure with low RPM was supposed to be aviation suicide. And yet here, standing on a muddy strip of coral and crushed stone in New Guinea, staring at fuel readings that shattered everything the Army Air Forces believed about engine management, one question lingered in the air thicker than the heat itself. What if everything they had been taught was wrong? That question followed Colonel Charles MacDonald later that afternoon as he sat in a sweltering tent, hunched over a checkerboard with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the game offering a brief illusion of normalcy in a place where nothing was normal anymore. Outside, insects buzzed relentlessly, and somewhere in the distance, engines roared as crews tested repaired aircraft. The knock at the screen door was polite, almost hesitant, but the voice that followed carried quiet authority. A middle-aged man in navy khakis stood framed by sunlight, his uniform crisp despite the humidity, his posture relaxed but unmistakably confident. He introduced himself simply. Charles Lindbergh. The name landed like an explosion that made no sound. MacDonald froze mid-move, the checker piece forgotten between his fingers. Everyone knew that name. Every pilot in America grew up with it. The spirit of St. Louis wasn't just history. It was mythology, the moment aviation stopped being a daredevil's trick and became a bridge across oceans. And now the man who had flown solo to Paris 17 years earlier stood in a combat zone asking to talk about fighter operations. Lindbergh explained that General Hutchinson had sent him. He wanted to learn about P-38 missions. Maybe, he said gently, share a few observations about long-range flying. MacDonald called in Colonel Warren Lewis, the officer who understood better than anyone the brutal mathematics facing P-38 units in the Pacific. When Lewis arrived, still damp from sweat and frustration, he took one look at Lindbergh and almost smiled in disbelief. Paradise, he joked, gesturing around at mud, metal hangars, and men stretched to exhaustion. But the question was serious. What could the most famous aviator alive want with their daily struggle? Lindbergh answered without drama. He was there to learn. And maybe to help. Maps came out. Routes were traced across endless blue water dotted with islands that looked insignificant on paper, but meant survival to pilots flying alone over the ocean. 6, 7, sometimes more than 7 hours in the cockpit. Fuel margins calculated down to the last gallon. A combat radius that existed on paper but vanished in reality. Every mission brief turned into a math problem with only one unforgiving rule: run out of fuel and you disappear. Lindbergh studied the maps with the intensity of a man who had spent his life thinking about distance and endurance. Fuel, he understood, wasn't just a number. It was time. It was range. It was whether you came home. When Lindbergh asked if they had experimented with different cruise settings, the room went quiet. Procedures were procedures. Manuals were manuals. You didn't deviate. That's how engines stayed alive. That's how pilots survived. Lindbergh listened, nodded, and then asked a question that unsettled everyone. Would they be interested in a demonstration? He had already flown AP-38 to the base. He wanted to join a combat mission. 2 days later, 43 pilots packed into a crude recreation hall, sitting on folding chairs or the dirt floor, their faces drawn and tired from too many hours aloft. Lindbergh stepped forward and spoke without preamble. Reduce RPM. Use autolean. Increase manifold pressure slightly. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was fear. Everything they had been taught screamed that this would destroy engines. Lindbergh told them calmly that they'd been taught wrong. The numbers he laid out were staggering. 30% fuel savings. Combat radius stretched hundreds of miles farther. Missions once considered impossible suddenly within reach. The resistance was fierce, rooted not in ignorance but survival. These men trusted procedures because procedures had kept them alive. Lindbergh didn't dismiss that fear. He challenged it. He asked how many instructors had actually flown 9-hour missions. How many manuals were written for endurance instead of engine longevity in training environments? Slowly, the logic began to crack the certainty. On July 3rd, Lindbergh proved it in the air. A mission that should have left them fuel-starved instead ended with Lindbergh landing with reserves that bordered on absurd. 72% fuel remaining after hours of flight and combat maneuvering. Ground crews measured. Remeasured. Numbers didn't lie. Engines showed no damage. Mission after mission confirmed it. Skepticism gave way to disbelief, then acceptance. The true test came in combat, during a brutal engagement near Wewak. Enemy fighters pressed hard. Fuel became a factor. Lindbergh maneuvered with precision, conserving power without sacrificing aggression. When a Japanese pilot turned in what looked like a ramming attack, Lindbergh responded instantly, sending the aircraft spiraling into the sea. It was his only aerial victory of the war, but it proved the point more clearly than any lecture ever could. Efficiency did not mean weakness. It meant control. By August 1944, the change was complete. Procedures rewritten. Manuals revised. Training transformed. Combat radius expanded. Missions once unimaginable became routine. Pilots flew longer with less fatigue. Engines lasted longer. Survival rates improved. Targets once protected by distance were suddenly vulnerable. What began as one civilian questioning doctrine became a quiet revolution that reshaped Pacific air warfare. In the end, the lesson was simple and unsettling. Even the most trusted knowledge can be wrong. Sometimes survival depends not on following the rules, but on understanding why they exist and knowing when to challenge them. And sometimes, saving fuel doesn't just extend a mission. Sometimes, it helps win a war.